Welcome to Mr. Phantom, where fear hides in every shadow and chilling tales come to life. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like this video to get a scary story every night. I never thought I'd end up in a place like this. A small, quiet town in Massachusetts, just outside of Salem. Famous for its dark history, though no one here talks about it much anymore. The streets are lined with old colonial-style houses, some beautifully restored, others abandoned and left to rot like relics of a forgotten past. My apartment sits in one of those classic brownstone buildings that have seen better days, but the rent is cheap, and for someone like me, a freelance graphic designer who prefers solitude over socializing, it's good enough. My name is Jake, and I moved here about a month ago. I used to live in the city, but after a nasty breakup and the suffocating weight of urban life pressing down on me, I needed an escape. The kind of escape where no one asks questions, and I don't have to explain why I left. I found this place through a rental listing online, a one-bedroom unit with a decent view of the street below, just a short walk from the town's tiny coffee shop and grocery store. Nothing fancy, but it suited me fine. Most of my neighbors are either elderly folks who've lived here their whole lives or young couples trying to get away from the chaos of Boston. There's a certain slowness to life here, a stillness that felt comforting at first. But even in a town this small, there are places people don't talk about. One of those places is the old house at the end of my street. From the moment I arrived, I noticed it. Unlike the other homes with neatly trimmed hedges and warm porch lights, this house stood in stark contrast. Its windows dark, its paint peeling like dead skin, its front yard overgrown with weeds. It looked like the kind of place kids would dare each other to step onto the porch on Halloween night, the kind of house that always seems just a little too cold, even in the summer. I remember asking my landlord about it when I first moved in. "Oh, that old place?" he had said, shaking his head. "No one's lived there for years. Used to be a family, but they up and left one night, just vanished. No moving trucks, no goodbyes. Just gone." That kind of story would have intrigued me if I had heard it back in the city. But here, it just left me with a sense of unease. I wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories, but something about that house felt wrong. Even during the day, it seemed out of place, like a wound in the middle of an otherwise peaceful neighborhood. I told myself it was just an old, abandoned house, nothing more. But then came the first night. It was late, probably around 2 in the morning. I had been working on a project, tweaking a client's logo design, when I realized how quiet it was outside. Too quiet. This town had a certain rhythm, a pattern of sounds that I had already gotten used to. The occasional car driving past, the distant hum of a train, the wind rustling through the trees. But that night it was different. The usual noises had faded away, replaced by something else. A song, soft, almost too faint to hear at first. A woman's voice, singing a slow, haunting melody. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I strained to listen. It wasn't coming from my building or from the street. It was coming from the direction of the abandoned house. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I was just tired, hearing things that weren't really there. But as I sat in the dim glow of my laptop screen, the voice became clearer. The tune was familiar, a lullaby I had heard as a child. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird." My skin prickled. It wasn't just the song itself that unsettled me. It was the way it was being sung. Slow, drawn out, almost mournful, like someone was whispering it to a baby who would never wake up. I got up from my chair and walked to my window, pushing aside the curtain just enough to get a look outside. The street was empty, bathed in the pale glow of a single flickering street lamp. My eyes locked onto the house at the end of the block. Its windows were as dark as ever, its front door shut. But the voice, it was definitely coming from there. I watched for a few more minutes, expecting to see some sign of movement. A shadow in the window, a flicker of light. But there was nothing. Just that eerie lullaby drifting through the air like a ghost's breath. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Maybe it was a prank. Some local kids trying to scare the new guy in town. Or maybe someone had broken into the house using it as a hideout. Either way, it wasn't my problem. But as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The voice had been too clear, too close, as if it had been meant for me to hear. I told myself I wouldn't think about it anymore, that I would wake up the next morning and forget it ever happened. But I didn't. The next night, it happened again. This time, I was already in bed when I heard it. The same song, the same voice, drifting through the night like a distant memory. I pulled the covers up to my chin, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, that I had planted the idea in my head and was now convincing myself it was real. But then, just as I was about to force myself to fall asleep, the song changed. The woman's voice wavered, cracked, as if she were on the verge of tears. And then, in the silence between the notes, I heard something else. A whisper. "Help me." I sat up so fast my head spun. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at my bedroom door, half expecting it to burst open. But my apartment was silent. I told myself I must have imagined it, that my tired brain had taken the lullaby and twisted it into something darker. But deep down, I knew better. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to ask around. I figured someone in town must know more about that house, why it was abandoned, who had lived there before. But when I brought it up at the coffee shop, the barista, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, just gave me a look. "You've been hearing it, haven't you?" she asked. I blinked. "The singing?" She nodded. "Ignore it." I frowned. "So, you know what I'm talking about?" She hesitated, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening. Then she leaned in and said, "You don't want to get involved with that house, sweetheart. Just pretend you never heard anything." That was the moment I realized something was seriously wrong. Because the way she said it, it wasn't just a warning. It was a plea. And yet, that night, when the lullaby came again, I did something I knew I shouldn't have done. I stepped outside, and I walked toward the house. I don't know what possessed me to leave my apartment that night. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something else. A pull I couldn't quite explain. Either way, I found myself stepping outside, the cold night air wrapping around me like a warning. The street was dead silent except for the faint melody drifting from the old house at the end of the block. The same song, the same haunting, fragile voice. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." Each note seemed to stretch through the darkness, echoing in a way that made my skin crawl. I swallowed hard, my breath visible in the cold, and forced my legs to move. As I walked, my heartbeat pounded in my ears. The closer I got to the house, the heavier the air felt, like I was wading through something unseen, something thick and oppressive. I had always dismissed ghost stories as nonsense, the kind of things people made up to scare themselves. But right then, standing in front of that house, I wasn't so sure anymore. The porch steps creaked beneath my weight as I climbed them. The door loomed in front of me, its peeling paint revealing the rotting wood beneath. I hesitated, glancing toward the windows. They were dark, empty, lifeless, and yet the voice was so clear now. "Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird." It wasn't coming from inside the house. It was coming from just beyond the door. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the doorknob. It was ice cold, and the sensation sent a shiver through me. I half expected it to be locked, but when I turned it, the door creaked open effortlessly. Darkness spilled out from inside, swallowing the dim light from the street lamp behind me. A damp, musty scent filled my nose, the kind of smell that spoke of things long forgotten, left to rot in silence. I took a cautious step inside. The air was thick, heavy with dust and something else, something metallic. Blood? No, that was ridiculous. I shook the thought away and pulled my phone from my pocket, switching on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow hallway ahead. The house was abandoned, that much was obvious. The wallpaper was peeling in long, curling strips. The wooden floor was warped, and pieces of furniture sat covered in tattered white sheets, untouched for what looked like decades. And yet someone or something was singing. I moved deeper inside, my footsteps slow, deliberate. The sound was louder now, coming from upstairs. I should have turned back. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to run, to pretend I had never set foot in this place. But something about that voice kept me moving forward, pulling me toward it like a moth to a flame. I reached the base of the staircase, tilting my phone upward. The wooden steps were cracked, some missing chunks as if someone had ripped them apart with their bare hands. Dust swirled in the air, catching in my throat as I took my first step up. The singing didn't stop. It didn't waver. It just kept going, soft and steady, as if whoever was singing had been doing so for years. I reached the second floor. The hallway stretched before me, lined with closed doors. My phone's flashlight flickered for a brief second before stabilizing again. And then, a whisper. "You're not supposed to be here." My breath hitched. The voice wasn't coming from the room where the singing had been. It was behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly dropped my phone. The hallway was empty. Empty. But I wasn't alone. Something was there. Watching. Waiting. The air around me had changed. The oppressive stillness had deepened, pressing against me like invisible hands. My fingers tightened around my phone, my heart hammering against my ribs. And then I saw it, just for a second. A shadow moved at the end of the hall, disappearing into the last room on the right. My breath came in short, sharp bursts. My mind screamed at me to leave, to turn around and run back down the stairs. But my feet carried me forward, down the hallway, past the closed doors that seemed to watch me like empty eyes. The last door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling from within. The singing had stopped. The silence was worse. I pushed the door open. The room was small, empty except for a wooden rocking chair sitting in the middle. Dust covered the floor in thick layers, undisturbed except for a set of footprints leading to the chair. The footprints were small, too small, a child's. And then I saw it. On the floor near the chair lay an old music box. Its lid was open, the tiny ballerina inside frozen mid-spin, the source of the singing. I took a slow step inside, the floor creaking beneath me. My phone's light flickered again. I swallowed, then crouched down, reaching out to touch the music box. Cold, as cold. A shudder ran through me as I lifted it. The metal was rusted, the paint chipped. The tiny key on its side was still turning, as if someone had just wound it up. But there was no one here. a sharp breath behind me. I turned. Nothing, but I felt it. Presence. The air in the room had dropped to a frigid chill, and my skin prickled as if something unseen was brushing against it. And then, just as I was about to stand up, the rocking chair moved, slowly creaking back and forth. My throat tightened. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to get out, to leave this cursed place behind. I took a step back, and the door slammed shut. Darkness swallowed the room. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to my feet, my hands fumbling for the doorknob. My phone's flashlight flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the walls. The air around me shifted. Something was behind me. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't turn around, but I didn't have a choice. A whisper, so close it sent ice through my veins. She's still here. My body moved on instinct. I yanked the door open and bolted down the hallway, taking the stairs 2 at a time. My breath was ragged, my heart a wild drumbeat in my chest. The front door loomed ahead. I didn't stop running. As I reached for the doorknob, I heard it again. That lullaby. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. But this time it wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from right behind me. I burst through the front door, nearly tripping over the porch steps as I stumbled into the street. Cold air filled my lungs as I turned, expecting to see something, anything, standing in the doorway. But the house was silent, empty, as if nothing had ever happened. But as I took a shaky step backward, my pulse still racing, I saw it. The rocking chair. It was still moving. And in the window above, just for a second, a figure, a small, pale face watching me. And then, gone. The house was empty again. But I knew the truth. I wasn't the only one watching that night. And whatever was in that house, it had been waiting for me. I barely remember how I got back to my apartment. My legs carried me, but my mind was somewhere else. Stuck in that house, in that room, replaying the sound of the music box over and over again in my head. The whisper, the figure in the window, the rocking chair that shouldn't have moved. By the time I locked my apartment door behind me, my hands were shaking. I pressed my back against the door, trying to slow my breathing, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I saw something, and it saw me. I collapsed onto my couch, running a hand through my hair. I needed to do something, anything, to distract myself. My laptop sat open on the desk, the project I had abandoned earlier still on the screen. I forced myself to sit down, to focus on the work in front of me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing toward the window, half expecting to see that face again. The pale, hollow eyes, the vacant expression, the silent, watching stare. It wasn't there, but I still felt it. Something was different now. Something had changed. I told myself I wouldn't go back to that house, that I had been lucky to get out, and whatever was in there, it wasn't meant for me. But then the singing came back. That night, just past 2 a.m, the lullaby drifted through my window again. Soft, melancholic, a woman's voice, lingering in the silence of the empty street. I shut my laptop, every muscle in my body tensing. No, it wasn't possible. I had seen the music box. It was just a wind-up toy, a relic from a forgotten past. Couldn't just start playing on its own. Could it? I hesitated, staring at the window. My curtains were drawn, but I didn't dare open them. I didn't want to see. I sat in silence, my breath shallow, waiting, hoping it would stop. Didn't. The singing continued, slow and deliberate, as if calling me back. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. I clenched my fists. No, I wasn't doing this. I wasn't going back. I wasn't going to let some stupid ghost story get inside my head. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt it. That pull. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something else. Something deeper. Something I couldn't explain. Something wanted me to come back. And that was the worst part. Because a small, traitorous part of me wanted to go. I didn't sleep that night. By the time morning came, I had convinced myself it was all a trick of the mind. Sleep deprivation, stress, maybe even an overactive imagination. But I needed answers. I spent the morning in the town's tiny library, a cramped old building that smelled like dust and forgotten stories. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with thin-rimmed glasses, barely glanced at me as I approached the counter, cleared my throat. Hey, I was wondering if you had any old records about the neighborhood? Maybe something about the house at the end of Oak Street. Her fingers froze over the keyboard. She finally looked up, her expression unreadable. Why do you ask? I hesitated. I just heard some stories about it. Figured I'd do some digging. She studied me for a long moment before sighing and typing something into her computer. Not much in the digital archives, she muttered. But if you're looking for old newspaper clippings, check the records in the back. Filing cabinets are sorted by year. She didn't offer any more help. I spent the next 2 hours sifting through yellowed papers, flipping through brittle pages that hadn't been touched in decades. At first, there was nothing, just old stories about town fairs, local crime reports, the occasional scandal. But then I found it. A small article buried in the back pages of a newspaper dated 1978. Family disappears without a trace. I scanned the article, my pulse quickening. The house at the end of Oak Street belonged to the Carter family, William and Mary Carter, along with their 6-year-old daughter, Lillian. According to the article, one night in late October, the entire family vanished. No signs of struggle. No forced entry. The house was found exactly as they had left it. Food still on the table, clothes neatly folded in the laundry basket. But they were gone, all except for one thing, their daughter's music box, found in the upstairs bedroom, still playing when the police arrived. A chill crawled down my spine. I flipped through more articles, looking for any follow-up. But there wasn't one. No bodies were ever found. No explanations. The case eventually faded into rumor, buried under decades of silence. But now I knew. The singing wasn't just some hallucination. It was Lillian, and she was still there. I left the library in a daze, the cold autumn wind biting at my skin. I barely noticed the people around me, my mind racing with everything I had just read. I had to tell someone. I found myself back at the coffee shop, my hands gripping my cup so tightly I thought it might crack. The barista from the other day was there again, the one who had told me to ignore it. I didn't hesitate this time. The Carters, I said, my voice low. What happened to them? Her face paled. She set down the mug she had been cleaning, exhaling slowly. You shouldn't be asking about that. I just need to know the truth. She looked around, making sure no one else was listening. Then she leaned in. The Carters were a good family, she murmured. But that house wasn't meant for them. I swallowed. What do you mean? She hesitated before speaking again. People say that house, it doesn't just take people. It keeps them. A lump formed in my throat. Keeps them. She nodded. Some folks think Lillian never left, that she's still waiting, and sometimes she sings. I felt sick. She must have seen the look on my face because she reached across the counter and grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. Listen to me. Whatever you've heard, whatever you think you've seen, you need to stay away from that house. I wanted to listen to her. I really did. But that night, when the singing returned, it wasn't coming from the old house anymore. It was coming from inside my apartment. I didn't move. Couldn't. I sat frozen on my couch, my fingers digging into the fabric, my breath caught in my throat. The lullaby was unmistakable, soft, sweet, and horribly out of place. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. The voice was no longer coming from the abandoned house at the end of the street. It was inside my apartment. I forced myself to swallow, my mouth dry as sandpaper. My eyes darted around the dimly lit room, searching for the source of the sound. My phone lay on the coffee table, its screen dark. The TV was off. The door was locked, and yet the singing continued. Slow, deliberate, closer. I stood up on shaky legs, my pulse hammering in my ears. The sound was coming from the bedroom. I didn't want to go in there. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run out the front door and never look back. But my body moved on its own, drawn forward by something I couldn't explain. The hallway leading to my bedroom felt longer than usual, stretching out like an impossible void. The floor creaked beneath my weight, the air thick with something unseen, a presence. The door to my room was open just a crack. The singing had stopped. I reached for the light switch, my fingers trembling. I flipped it on. The room was empty. My bed was unmade, the blankets twisted from where I had tossed and turned the night before. The closet door was shut. The curtains were drawn. Nothing was out of place. And yet, I knew I wasn't alone. My eyes landed on my nightstand, and my stomach twisted into a knot. There, sitting perfectly centered on the wooden surface, was a small, rusted music box. Couldn't breathe. I had left it in the abandoned house. I had never brought it home. And yet, here it was. The ballerina inside was still spinning, the delicate tin figure twirling in a slow, jerky motion. The key on the side was unwinding, the last few notes of the lullaby playing softly before the mechanism came to a halt. I took a step back, my foot catching on the rug. My heart pounded so violently it hurt. This wasn't possible. This wasn't possible. A whisper brushed against my ear. She's waiting. I spun around, my back slamming into the nightstand. My phone fell to the floor with a dull thud, but I barely heard it over the sound of my own ragged breathing. There was no one there, but the air in the room had changed, thick with something invisible, something watching. I grabbed the music box with shaking hands, my fingers barely working as I stumbled back toward the hallway. I needed to get rid of it. I needed to throw it away, burn it, destroy it. But as soon as I stepped out of the room, the door slammed shut behind me. I screamed. My body moved on instinct, bolting down the hallway and into the living room. My hands fumbled with the locks on the front door, twisting and yanking until it finally flew open. Cold air hit my face as I stumbled into the night. I ran. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the block, my breath coming in gasping, uneven bursts. The street was empty, the distant hum of the city barely registering in my ears. I looked down at the music box still clutched in my hands. The ballerina had stopped spinning. The lid was open, and inside something had changed. There was a name scratched into the metal. Lillian. I didn't go back to my apartment that night. Instead, I found myself standing in front of the old house again, my breath fogging in the cold air. The windows were dark, the structure looming over me like a silent predator. I didn't want to be here, but I had to be. I had to end this. I climbed the porch steps, the wood groaning beneath my weight. The front door was still unlocked, the way I had left it. I stepped inside. The house smelled of dust and decay, the air heavy with something ancient. My flashlight cast long, jagged shadows along the walls as I moved forward. I clutched the music box tighter. I didn't know what I was expecting. Some kind of explanation, a spirit waiting for me, a final, terrible truth. I reached the base of the stairs and hesitated. The air was different now, colder. Something was waiting for me. I climbed the steps one by one, my heartbeat filling the silence. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched before me, lined with the same closed doors. But this time, I didn't have to guess which one to enter. One door was open, the last door. The rocking chair was still in the center of the room, but now it was occupied. A girl sat there, her small frame illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the window. She couldn't have been older than 6, her dark hair falling over her face. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers curled around something unseen. My throat went dry. Lillian, she lifted her head. Her eyes were hollow, empty, but she was smiling. The chair rocked slowly as she tilted her head. Her gaze locked onto mine. "Did you bring it back?" she asked, her voice small. I looked down at the music box. My hands trembled. "Yes," I whispered. Her smile widened. The air in the room shifted. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching unnaturally. I took a slow step forward, extending the music box toward her. She reached out, and then everything changed. The room went pitch black. A force slammed into me, knocking me backward. My head hit the floor, my vision swimming as the world spun. The lullaby started again, but it was wrong now. Warped, distorted. The ballerina inside the music box spun wildly, faster and faster, until it was just a blur of metal and movement. I gasped for breath, my limbs heavy, the air thick like water pressing in on me. A voice, her voice, whispered in my ear, "You shouldn't have come back." I tried to move, tried to scream, but something cold wrapped around my wrists, dragging me down, into the darkness. I woke up to silence, thick, oppressive, wrong. I was lying on something hard and cold. My body ached, my limbs stiff and heavy as if I had been lying here for hours. My fingers twitched against the rough surface beneath me. Wood, old and splintered. For a moment I didn't move. My mind struggled to piece together what had happened. The house, Lillian, the music box, the voice whispering in my ear, "You shouldn't have come back." I forced my eyes open. Darkness, but not complete. A dim, bluish glow seeped in from somewhere above me, barely enough to make out my surroundings. I tried to sit up, wincing at the sharp pain that shot through my skull. I wasn't in the bedroom anymore. I wasn't even in the house. I was underground. I sucked in a shaky breath, my pulse hammering in my ears. The space around me was cramped, the air damp and stale. Wooden beams stretched overhead, supporting the low ceiling of what looked like a crawl space? A basement? No, a cellar. I pushed myself onto my elbows, my heartbeat a frantic rhythm against my ribs. How had I gotten here? I had been in that room, I had seen her, Lillian, sitting in the rocking chair, her hollow eyes locked onto mine. Then nothing. I tried to stand, but my head spun, my legs unsteady beneath me. I braced myself against the nearest wooden beam, breathing through the dizziness. Then I heard it, a sound, soft, subtle, breathing, not mine. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I turned my head slowly, my muscles locking in place. Something was in here with me. The breathing was faint but rhythmic, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond my limited vision. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound wasn't coming from in front of me. It was coming from below. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. The floor beneath me was made of uneven dirt, patches of rotted wooden planks scattered haphazardly across it. And beneath one of those planks, the breathing, I dropped to my knees, my hands shaking as I reached out. My fingers curled around the edges of the wood, and with a deep breath, I pulled. The plank lifted with a groan, revealing nothing but darkness beneath. A hole. No, not just a hole. A grave. And inside, a body. I jerked back, bile rising in my throat. The corpse was small, barely more than a skeleton. Its remains curled in on itself as if it had died trying to claw its way out. A child. A little girl. My stomach twisted violently, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Lillian. This was her. I had found her, but that meant she had never left. She had never escaped. She had been trapped here all along. And now so was I. I scrambled back, my hands slipping against the dirt. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with something suffocating. I needed to get out. Now, then the whisper came again. Why did you come back? The voice didn't come from the corpse. Came from behind me. I turned. Asterisk, asterisk, too fast. Too scared. Asterisk, asterisk, and something lunged. Cold hands grabbed my wrist. A flash of pale skin. Hollow eyes. A gaping mouth. I screamed. Darkness swallowed me whole. I came to in the middle of the room. The cellar was different now. The wooden beams overhead groaned as if the entire house above me was breathing. The ground beneath me was damp, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. I wasn't alone. I could feel her, watching, waiting. I turned my head slowly. There, just beyond the reach of the dim light, she stood. Lillian, not the child from the rocking chair, not the skeletal remains buried beneath the floor, but something else, something wrong. Her body was too still, too rigid, her head tilted unnaturally to the side, her dark hair hanging over her face, and she was smiling. I forced myself to move, inching backward on trembling hands and knees. Lillian, my voice barely worked. I'm sorry. Her smile widened. You brought it back, she whispered. The music box. My gaze snapped to my hands. It was still there, clutched between my fingers, the metal cold against my skin. I had tried to get rid of it. I had tried to leave it behind, but it always came back. Lillian took a slow step forward. I scrambled to my feet. I don't want it, I said, my voice cracking. You can have it. Just let me go. The shadows around her shifted. The air pulsed. You don't understand. Her voice wasn't right anymore. It was layered, many voices at once, speaking in perfect, eerie unison. The ground trembled beneath me. The cellar walls seemed to breathe, the wood groaning and stretching. Lillian's hollow eyes bored into mine. You brought it back, she repeated, her voice turning colder. Her fingers twitched. And suddenly, the music box opened on its own. The ballerina inside spun violently, the lullaby pouring out in twisted, distorted notes. I gasped as pain exploded in my head, a sharp, piercing sound drilling into my skull. I clutched my temples, staggering backward. Flashes of something terrible filled my vision. A little girl, locked in the cellar, scratching at the wooden planks, screaming, crying, and then silence, buried, forgotten, alone. I doubled over, my breath ragged. My mind swam with the truth I had never wanted to see. Lillian hadn't been haunting the house. She had been trapped here, waiting for someone to find her, waiting for someone to remember. And I had brought it back. Not just the music box, the memory. I looked up at her, my vision blurring. "What do you want?" I whispered. Lillian took another step forward. The shadows behind her twisted, stretching out like grasping hands. She didn't answer. She didn't have to, because I already knew. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want to hurt me. She wanted to trade places, and the music box had already chosen. The lullaby reached its final note. The ballerina stopped spinning, and everything went black. I woke up gasping for air. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. My mind reeled, my body numb, as if I had been submerged in ice-cold water. My lungs burned, and my ears were ringing with the ghost of that last note from the music box. I blinked rapidly, forcing my vision to clear. I wasn't in the cellar anymore. I was back in my apartment. I sat up too quickly, the sudden movement making my head spin. My hands gripped the sheets beneath me. My sheets, my bed, my room. It was over. Had it all been a dream? No, I knew better than that. The details were too sharp, the fear still clinging to my skin like sweat. I could still hear the way Lillian's voice had twisted and fractured, the way the shadows in that cellar had moved like something alive. I sucked in a shaky breath and glanced toward my nightstand. The music box was gone. A wave of relief rushed through me, almost making me dizzy. Maybe it had just disappeared. Maybe returning it to the house had broken whatever nightmare I had gotten myself tangled in. But something still felt wrong. I threw my legs over the side of the bed, my feet touching the floor. My apartment was silent, too silent. No distant city noise, no hum of the refrigerator, no ticking from the clock on the wall. I stood up cautiously. The air was thick, heavy, unnatural, like the house had been. I stepped out of the bedroom and into the living room, my pulse drumming in my ears. My apartment looked the same, but something about it felt off. The colors seemed muted, the edges of the furniture slightly blurred, like I was walking through a memory or a dream. I reached for my phone on the coffee table. The screen didn't turn on. No matter how many times I pressed the button, it stayed black. I moved to the window, my breath catching in my throat. The city was gone. Where the buildings should have been, there was nothing but a vast, endless fog. A void. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting. I wasn't home. I was somewhere else. A whisper brushed against my ear. "You brought it back." I spun around, my back hitting the wall. Lillian stood in the center of the room. Not the fragile, broken skeleton from the cellar. Not the pale, eerie child from the rocking chair. She looked normal now, real, alive. Her dark hair was neatly combed, her skin no longer gray and sunken. She was wearing a simple white dress, her hands folded in front of her. She smiled, and then I saw her reflection in the window. It wasn't hers. It was mine. or rather, it should have been mine. But the person standing in the reflection wasn't me. It was her. Her face, her body, her movements inside my skin. And I wasn't there at all. I pressed my hands against my chest, my stomach, my arms. I could feel myself, but in the glass, in the mirror world, I didn't exist. I shook my head violently. No, 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 no. Lillian took a step closer. This is the trade, she said softly. You brought it back. My breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. This isn't real. Her head tilted. Isn't it? I turned and ran. Straight for the door. Straight for the exit. Straight for anything that could take me out of this nightmare. But as soon as I reached for the handle, the door wasn't there. Just wall. I let out a strangled sound, my fingers scraping against smooth, solid plaster. I turned back toward the room, my heart pounding like a war drum. Lillian stood exactly where she had been, watching me. There's no way out, she whispered. I shook my head. No, I whispered. No, this isn't happening. She smiled. You gave me your place. I felt the weight of her words sink into my bones. A deep, crawling horror blooming in my chest. I looked at the window again. The reflection of my body, her body, stood there, shifting slightly. I watched as her lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. She lifted her hand, my hand, and placed it against the glass. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. A force pulled at me, not physically, not in a way I could fight against. Something deeper, like my soul was unraveling, like the world was pulling me into the glass. The edges of my vision blurred, my limbs feeling lighter, hollow. I stumbled forward, my hands reaching for anything to hold on to. Lillian just watched. The last thing I saw before everything shattered was my own reflection, smiling, and then darkness. I woke up to the sound of breathing, shallow, soft. I opened my eyes. I was in a room, a familiar room, the rocking chair, the peeling wallpaper, the dust hanging thick in the air, the house. I was back in the abandoned house. But something was different. The world felt smaller now, more distant, like I wasn't really here at all, like I was watching from somewhere far away. I tried to move, couldn't. Panic flooded my chest. My limbs wouldn't respond. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sitting. I wasn't lying down. I was standing, but I couldn't move, couldn't blink, couldn't breathe. Then, slowly, the realization crept in. I wasn't standing. I was on the shelf. My body, my real body, wasn't mine anymore. And in my place, on the dusty wooden shelf, inside the music box, the ballerina spun. I wanted to scream, but there was no sound. Just the soft, delicate notes of the lullaby. The music box played on. And outside, in the real world, Lillian walked away. In my body, she never looked back. The lid of the music box snapped shut, and I was trapped. Forever. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. Couldn't. The world was gone. The air, the sounds, the feeling of weight in my limbs. All of it had been ripped away, leaving behind a crushing nothingness. My consciousness drifted in a place where time didn't exist, where my thoughts spun in endless, meaningless circles. I was trapped. I was inside the music box. At first, I didn't understand. My mind rejected it. Denial clung to me like a second skin. This wasn't real. Couldn't be real. But the truth pressed down on me, suffocating in its clarity. I wasn't in my body anymore. I wasn't me anymore. I was the ballerina, I couldn't see, not in the way I used to. The outside world was a blur of shadows and muffled noises, but I could feel it. The tiny, delicate shape of my porcelain limbs, the stiff, painted smile on my face, the weightless, mechanical way I turned on my pedestal. And worst of all, the music never stopped playing. It looped over and over, a haunting lullaby that clawed at my sanity. I had no way of knowing how much time had passed, how long I had been here, how long I would stay here. Forever. The word echoed through me, a silent scream in the emptiness. I fought against the music box. I tried to move, to break free, to force myself out of this tiny prison. But my body wasn't my own anymore. I was bound by something stronger than fear, stronger than will. The magic, the curse, whatever this was, it had its hooks deep inside me. I was trapped, and Lillian was free. The thought burned hotter than any nightmare. She was out there now, walking around in my skin, living my life. She had taken everything, and I had given it to her. I brought it back. I should have never touched the music box. I should have left the house the first time I heard the lullaby drifting through the night. I should have listened when I felt that first whisper of unease in my bones. But it was too late. Too late. I felt the music box shift. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, something changed. A new presence loomed outside. Heavy footsteps. The sound of someone picking me up. A rush of movement and then, light. Blinding, searing light. The lid of the music box had been opened. I couldn't see the person holding it, not really, but I could sense them. Someone new. A stranger. And then, their voice. A man. Curious. Hesitant. What the hell? A pause. Then the soft, familiar sound of the key turning. The mechanism inside me clicked into place, and I spun. The music played. The haunting lullaby filled the air once more, its delicate notes threading through the silence. And with it came something else. A whisper. Not mine. Hers. Lillian. You brought it back. A rush of horror surged through me. No, 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 not again. The music box had found a new owner, a new victim, and as the melody danced around us, I felt it happen. The pull, the curse sinking into him. I tried to scream, to warn him, to tell him to run, but there was no sound, no escape, only the song, only the spinning ballerina, only the cycle beginning all over again. I spun. The haunting melody drifted from my tiny prison, each note pulling the world deeper into its grasp. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't do anything but watch, if this even counted as watching. My mind was aware, my thoughts screamed, but my body was no longer mine. The music box had been opened. A new victim had arrived. The man's breath was uneven as he stared down at me. I could feel his curiosity turning to unease, the shift in his pulse, the way his fingers twitched as if fighting the instinct to let go. You brought it back. Lillian's voice drifted around us like a ghost. I wanted to warn him. I wanted to shout, to beg him to close the box, to throw it away, to destroy it before it was too late. But the curse had its hooks in him now, just like it had in me. The air in the room changed, a subtle shift, so faint it might have gone unnoticed if I hadn't already known what was coming. The temperature dropped, the shadows in the corners stretched, deepened, becoming more than just darkness. The man inhaled sharply. Jesus! His voice was barely above a whisper, as if he was afraid to be heard. He was right to be afraid. The moment the music started, the house was no longer just a house. It was awake, and something was coming. I could feel it. Lillian's presence. lingering at the edges of reality. She was waiting, watching, hunting, because that's what she did. She took, she stole, she traded, and now she had found her next bargain. The man tried to set the music box down, but his hands trembled. I could feel his heartbeat pounding against his ribs, the way dread curled in his stomach like a sickness. He didn't understand what was happening yet, but soon he would. The lights flickered, the air hummed, charged with something unnatural, something hungry. Then a whisper, not Lillian this time, something worse. Who sings the song? The man froze. I knew that voice. It was the same one I had heard when I first entered this house. The whisper from the cellar. The one that wasn't Lillian. Panic flared inside me. No, this wasn't how it was supposed to go. The trade, the cycle, it was always the same. The victim takes the music box. The song plays. Lillian steals their body, and the curse repeats. But this was different. The man exhaled a shuddering breath. Who's there? A pause. Then, slow, deliberate footsteps echoed from the hallway. Something was coming. Couldn't see it, but I felt it. A heavy, crawling presence slithering toward him, drawn by the music like a moth to flame. I spun. The melody continued, delicate and inescapable. The man backed away from the music box, his breathing turning ragged. He sensed it too. And then, the voice spoke again. Who sings the song? This time it was closer. Right behind him, the man whipped around. Silence. Nothing there. But I knew better. It was watching, waiting. And then, a second voice. Soft, gentle, familiar. I do. Lillian. I felt the shift the moment she stepped forward into the light. She had my body. She looked just like me. Same face, same voice, same expression of wide-eyed fear. But I knew the truth. It wasn't me anymore. And the man, he hesitated. That was his mistake. Because the moment he looked at her, the game changed. Lillian smiled and lunged. The lights died. Darkness swallowed everything. The music stopped. For the first time since I had been trapped inside this prison, the melody cut off mid-note, like a breath caught in the throat. And then, screaming, raw, choked, desperate. I knew what was happening. I had lived it. He was being ripped away just like I had been. His soul torn from his body, his place taken, his voice swallowed. And then, silence. No breathing. No movement. No life. I waited for the music to start again, for the cycle to repeat, for Lillian to close the music box and walk away with her new face. But something was wrong. The music didn't play. The gears didn't turn. I was still trapped, still inside. But Lillian hadn't won, because this time, she had been the one to answer. I do. The words replayed in my head, cold and final. And then I realized she had taken my place. But she had also made a deal with something else. Something older than her. The thing in the cellar. And now, it had taken her. Lillian had spent decades tricking people into the trade, stealing their bodies, escaping, living their lives. But she had never been the one to answer the question. Not until now. And just like that, the game was over. The curse was broken. The walls of my prison shattered. And I fell. When I opened my eyes, I was me again. My hands, my legs, my body, my voice. I was alive. I gasped, my lungs burning as if I had been holding my breath for a lifetime. My knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the cold, wooden floor of the abandoned house. The music box lay beside me, open, but the ballerina was gone, and so was Lillian. I sat there, shaking, my heart hammering against my ribs. The house was silent, the air was still, and for the first time, I was free. The music box was empty. No more trades, no more stolen lives. It was over. I forced myself to my feet, my legs barely able to hold me up. I staggered to the door, my fingers fumbling for the knob, turned, and this time, it opened. Fresh air rushed over me. The night was quiet, the streetlights flickering. The real world. I stepped outside, and behind me, the house side, a low creaking groan. The windows shattered, the walls buckled inward, like something inside had been ripped away. Then, with one final whispered breath, the house collapsed, and the music box turned to dust. I stood there, staring at the ruins, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Lillian was gone. The curse was gone. And I was alive. For the first time in a long, long time, I was free. The end.